colored people can't be wrong. These are the driving sounds of the 13th floor elevators.
Hello, I'd like to thank you for allowing me into your homes for this 19th episode of Season 5 of Esoteric Science Roundtable. And I want to first begin by thanking everyone that took the time to come out to the metaphysical, philosophical meetings that we here at Esoteric Science Roundtable and Jeff Contreras from Therefore I Am co-host each and every third Wednesday of the month. And definitely had a nice turnout, and do appreciate everyone taking, again, the time to come out and share and exchange with us. Also, Freeman is pretty much like an honorable mention co-host as well, because he's there pretty consistently and also contributes quite a bit as well. So I want to thank Freeman also for helping us out with that meeting as well. I want to also remind folks that we do have quite a few videos and different things posted on the Google video between the show here, Esoteric Science Roundtable. There's a lot of Jeff Contreras' Therefore I Am, and there are quite a few things that Freeman has posted as well. So please, if you're interested, take the time to take a look at that and see if you want to find anything of interest in. Again, it allows you to view some of the stuff that you may have found interesting in the past, or review it, or if you haven't seen the show, missed the show, what have you, you can have an opportunity to see it again at your leisure. And this has also greatly enhanced our ability to bring this information out to other people, and we've, by virtue of that, had contacts with folks outside of our little Austin area here, and I'm thankful for that opportunity as well. Lastly, real quick, I want to thank very deep thanks to my boss, Tony, for going above and beyond the call of duty to help me maintain my job. I'm not going to get into that too much, but I just want to thank him a lot for helping alleviate a lot of stress that I've had lately. Let's see, so the show title is The Word, and I want to begin with a familiar phrase, maybe a paraphrase of a familiar phrase that many have heard before, especially those that have been raised Christian. That in the beginning was the Word. And so if we can think about the inception point of manifestation, when did everything actually initially start? What was the beginning point? What exactly took place at that instant or in that process that allowed for all these things to manifest that we know now is the manifest universe around us? And so, biblically speaking, and also the other great religious traditions of the world also have very, very similar phraseology or wording to describe the way in which the Word became something substantial, something manifest. Our universe is, again, based on sound according to the varying religious traditions of the world. And so if we think about the beginning point, the inception point, whether there was a big bang or, however we want to choose to consider the inception point, there was at some point some emission of sound that equated to everything in manifestation. All things in manifestation, everything that eventually individualized, planets and comets and stars and us on down to the smallest thing in manifestation, does have its own frequency. So all things have a numeric quantity that the form is based upon. And so all these numeric quantities collectively make what is our manifest universe. And so if we think about all these things playing out collectively, there are so many things in existence. It's really quite breathtaking and awe-inspiring, really, if we really can take all that in and think about how all these things work together collectively. If we do choose to think in the terms of a hypothesis, at least, that there is some creative force, God or whatever you want to term it, that put all this into motion, and that it does all work, if you will, very synchronously and in very much harmony and in a fine-tuned fashion, as far as I'm concerned. And so, again, all things in manifestation having their own frequency, having in essence their own tone. So all things you can think of also as emitting a tone that is reflective of what they are as well. And so there is a great and grand symphony playing out at all times, basically based on the exchange of all things in manifestation. And so if we think about the term, the logos, which is a Greek word for the word, this is something also that is considered in esoteric terms, that in particular planets have a logos, they have a word, they have a consciousness indwelling the globe that has a purpose, it has a will, it has a fixed determination, it has work to do, if you will. And so if all planets do have a consciousness, just as we have a consciousness, and animals have a consciousness, and even the lesser kingdoms as well, flower, or the plant rather, and the mineral as well, they all have their own form of consciousness. So we tie into this, and we can get some understanding of this, that and science does tend to demonstrate this in some levels as well. But as far as there being a consciousness that is creating any, the tone or the hertz level that the planet resonates at, that science is familiar with, the Schumann frequency, I believe is the term. Again, our planet has that own unique frequency that if you think of astrology as well as a science, or at least think about it hypothetically as a science, that this is where we get the influence from astrology, the way in which the different tunings of the planets and the stars align allows for a different emission of sound, a different combinations of sound, and so a chord can be struck, if you will, if there's a triune, or if there are different things are in conjunction, then those individual sounds will collectively work and focus at some level, at least periodically, to influence us. And so we have our own tone, and when these heavenly bodies move and rearrange themselves and orchestrate their wanderings, then they in turn do influence and affect us, I should say, rather, as well. And that, again, science hasn't really, proven that one conclusively at all, but nonetheless, it's interesting to consider in those terms in the context of this evening's discussion. So, again, everything having a tone, everything having an ability to relate to one another by virtue of this. And this is also a way in which certain things can identify other things. And certainly we can look to nature for examples within the insect community, whales and dolphins and things of that nature that definitely do get by using sound, and this is a very important part of their sustaining themselves. And so if we do think in terms of sustaining, the word, once it has been emitted, has to be maintained, and so it has to be clearly ringing out and maintain itself, maintain the integrity of the clarity and all these different characteristics in order to maintain the structural integrity, to maintain the form. And so for as long as the word is uttered, that is the duration of anything in manifestation. Once the word begins to be retracted, then the structure will begin to collapse and will fall. And if we think about sound in the terms also that sound congeals, sound can attract, sound can unify and bring things together. Sound can also be destructive and disruptive and can break things apart. And so this is really, again, back to the basis of our inception. Our form is built up and destroyed by sound, ultimately. And so we can really demonstrate that more and more. In science, I'm confident we'll be able to demonstrate that more and more as we progress. So again, keeping in mind all things in manifestation have their frequency. And at higher levels, when a consciousness takes on form for some particular purpose, the element of sacrifice is factored in. And even with us, we do sacrifice to a certain degree and come into manifestation to hopefully perfect our physical vehicle through our experiences and through our accumulated knowledge and our livingness. And so if we can consider things also like that great and grand consciousnesses do incarnate in order to carry out a purpose, that they're willfully sacrificing themselves. And it's said that the consciousness that indwells our planet will not be completed with this work until the last weary pilgrim continues home, in essence. And so there will be redemption for all humanity. There's talk of different numbers and different traditions, 144,000, that are on the salvation end of things or what have you. Ultimately, all things in manifestation will achieve some state of perfection, relatively speaking. And it's a matter of, again, the form and the frequency. Once those things meet properly, you have what is termed relatively perfection on this planet. And there are those that have attained that, and that we can look to for examples of that as well. Certain teachers allegedly have attained that state, and I tend to believe that there are those that have attained and maintained that state, that emit that perfect tone, if you will, that perfect frequency. And so, since I have the video up, I want to go ahead and speak a bit about the process of cymatics. And this is a very good physical representation, demonstration that will show just how matter reacts to sound. All of these little filings and all these little small particles are moving because a different sound is being emitted on a sound plate. And as the pitch changes, then the structure and the shape, the arrangement alters. And this is very much a graphic representation of exactly what happens when you have motion. You have this, look at this spiraling rhythmic motion, this snake-like motion that you have as a result of these forms cropping up by sound. This is just a pile of dust, basically, a pile of metal filings. And when you emit the proper sound, you get the motion, you get the form. And this is what God does. This is, in essence, what God does in manifestation. This is, again, a simplified form, but this is in my estimation, a very good way to help demonstrate just exactly what is taking place when you do add sound and then you change the pitch. And you can see a lot of spiral, and I spoke previously last week about the whole spiral nature of energy working out, especially through the centers in the body, and I will touch on that again as that relates to form a little bit later in the show also. But a lot of basic structures that simple animals and little simple organisms are based upon look like these shapes. They are replicated in this, and we see examples in nature again that at the simple state, this is what God is doing initially, and then the building blocks can accrue and accumulate from there and change and alter, and evolution, I do feel, does take place. There is a definite divine moving through manifestation, and so I think we are working towards an ultimate culmination, some purpose on the planet. And the more we understand the way in which God chooses to work, the more we can assist in the process. The more we understand these things, these very simple examples like this that help us to gain understanding along these lines. Even if we think about the ideas of resonation and with the spoken word, and I spoke before about the throat being the creative center. It's energetically the creative center, but also when we use words to communicate, we also can create. And certainly we think of singers and entertainers and those that use their voice professionally in addition as well. And so communication, obviously, in this day and age is very, very highly esteemed, prized, and people clamor for ways in which to gain information. And so the spoken word certainly is one way of communicating and conveying information, exchanging. We also, when we think about words, words can hurt and words can heal. And when we think about the tone of our voice, the inflection of our voice, and very much the intent that we have behind the words. If we're angry and we use words, as we teach young children, it's not really a good thing. And we teach the young children as well, use your words, use your words. We want children to engage in that form of communication as opposed to, obviously hitting each other and throwing things. So at the very basic level, this is a lesson that we often forget, very often forget, that the way in which we engage others, the way in which we choose to communicate with others makes a big effect. And the words that we utter do affect others. And we can, again, we can hurt or help depending on the words we choose to use. And that's why caution, care, and consideration are recommended before we say anything. If we can stop before we start and note, instead of having to pull the words back and regret what we said and realize that we said something that's injurious to someone that may have offended them or what have you. And again, I'm not one for PC language very much. I really miss like the old Archie Bunker stuff and the Sanford and Son and stuff like that, where people weren't so uptight about that sort of thing. That it's another way in which words we've been programmed to think about words in a certain way, and that's a whole other aspect too. I probably won't delve into that too much. That's more Freeman's neck of the woods. But again, we can attract with words, or we can repel with words, and that's certainly up to us. Again, and I would caution everybody to use a little discernment, a little care and consideration in their daily lives, in the workplace or wherever, when they're dealing with other people, even shopping, what have you. The simplest exchanges, please try to use care in your communications, because we I think owe that to our fellow humanity as a point of respect, just to try to go from that point. Let's see. Also, I mentioned about well, in that context as well, there are people that also are motivational speakers. And they get paid a lot of money to come in and pump a crowd up and let them know that they can do something, they can lose weight, or they can, be successful in business, or a number of things. Again, I want to point back to the cymatics video again. There's further examples of how sound causes form. It's causing these little particles to ball up, just very much in the same sense that a sphere, a planet would, and then other things build up from these little simple forms. So again, the motivational speakers, the coach before the big game that gives the pep talk to the team and gets them all, all fired up and that sort of thing. So that's another aspect of that as well. When we think of prayer, that's another thing too. That is a way in which we choose to communicate back to our inception point, back to the source. That original sound that was uttered, we attempt to mimic in many respects. And this is something that has been reflected in many religious traditions. Certainly, many might be familiar with the Om from the East. Amen is a derivative of that, actually, that's been popularized in the West. Prayer, that invocation, that creating an utterance of adoration or praise or respect or a plea to, again, our source, to that word that we are emitted from, that we are a portion of ultimately. And so we hope to attract with our proper petition the proper results. and that's been an age-old exchange as well, that plea to the divine that's been taking place forever. And invocation is another means of exchanging that in that respect as well. It's a bit more focused. It's a bit more of it's more from the mental plane than it is from the emotional plane that prayer and aspiration and devotion would normally arise from. But an invocation, a fixed invocation, determined fixed will, when one is engaging with, again, the architect, the grand composer of the universe, that we can invoke and instill some qualities through that interaction as well. And that's becoming more and more potent and more prominent in our humanity as the faculty of mind becomes more prominent within mankind as well. As mind becomes more acute, we seek to invoke and work scientifically and intelligently with the creative forces, as opposed to hope that some prayer or some wish or some longing will be answered in that fashion. And so, again, it has more laser light honing potency, if you will, when we use an invocation. It's curious when we consider much of what has been established through the Western magic tradition and the invoking of God names. And the language that is most often used in the invoking of God names is Hebrew. And so the Hebrew God names are uttered, and they correspond, they have a planetary correspondence, and this ties into the tree of life, and this is a lot of the ABCs of Western occultism. And so these God names should be uttered in the way in which they're supposed to be uttered. And Hebrew is always a tricky creature because it doesn't have vowels, and so there's always different interpretations. And so very recently, Jeff Contreras put on his Western Mystery Conference, and you had a point in which one of the speakers engaged the crowd, excuse me, and asked them to invoke a few God names. And so this was a point of interest to me. I was reasonably familiar with them from doing some of this stuff in the past with other people. But hearing the different, the different intonations and the different pauses between syllables and what have you, there tends to be a lot of people being really over-fixated on that and then getting caught up in the exact proper pronunciation of these God names and things of that nature when they're working in this ceremonial ritual fashion. And so, again, it was curious to hear all the different people. It wasn't really as as synchronous as you might think if they're all allegedly supposed to be vibrating, this from the same language and, trying to get it right in the context of how, to achieve the proper energy exchange. And so there was definitely not much accord. Well, there was, I don't want to knock it completely, but there could have been more accord, I'll put it that way. And then another gentleman, and I'll get to the point of this very quickly, another gentleman introduced the similar invoking of God names in relation to the tree, but did not use the God names, but used common everyday names, rather than use the Tiferet, the Christ Center. He used love and used more common words common to the English language. And so everyone said those words collectively, enunciated them, very similarly. And so there, in my estimation, was a lot more impact behind that invocation because everyone was more on the same page. There wasn't this predisposition of, I have to get this little pause in right before I say the next part of this phrase. And my buddy's standing next beside me, and he needs to, know that I know how to say my God names and then do this properly. And so, again, that's just one aspect of it that I thought was curious. And this again, invoking of the Hebrew names and using an original tongue, definitely over years you find that energy builds up when you use a certain phrase. Like the Lord's Prayer, for instance, is one example of that you used over time has amassed a lot of energy, and a lot of people have used it, continue to use it, and so all the wishes, wants, prayers, the intent and the plea behind the using of that prayer have all kind of amassed, if you will, and there's a lot of energy behind that's been built up. And so the Catholic Church, when they use the Latin Mass, that's certainly one example of that over time, and there's another thing as well, not knowing Latin or not knowing a particular language isn't really a huge deal. It's just basically attuning yourself to the frequency and the sounds of the priest, using the Mass, for instance, or opening yourself up to the uttering of a Hebrew God name, for instance, or anything along those lines. If you're doing something in a devotional or ritualistic fashion, that's just kind of part and parcel of it, that you're tuning with and becoming one with that intonation and that collectiveness too. And that's another, that kind of leads to the next aspect of this, is seeing when people work together, considering that everyone has their own individual tone. When you work together, and let's say you are working together and you're uttering some God names, you've got not only the individual pitch and tune or what have you of each person's voice collectively added together, you have the basic essence that each person is tied into. Excuse me. And so you're going to have the tune of each person, and then you're going to have the collective sounding of the voices. And so this is going to make a melding or a blend as well, and you're going to get different combinations and different qualities depending on the different people that work together. And this is going to be one of the future considerations for group work. There will be more consideration as to who works well energetically together, the way in which the workplace is set up, and a lot of things work in this day and age. It's kind of more randomness. This person's affiliated with this organization, and so are these guys, and so, hey, you're going to work with these guys. You and you and you work together. More so in the future, there will be more consideration as to the underlying energetic, and what I've spoken of on shows in the past about the rays, the 7 rays so-called, and that sevenfold expression of sound, if you will ultimately continue to be more and more prominently figured into considerations of group dynamics and healing and a lot of other things as well. But psychology certainly, everything's going to be based on that more so in the future. But the idea that the collective, that we do emit this tone, and collectively when we have a group dynamic, it's going to reflect that as well. It's going to emit collectively that tone, that chord. Or we could think of us as being different words, excuse me, in a sentence. And if you have more people, then you've got paragraphs, and you've got enough people, you've got a virtual book, a virtual walking book, or a virtual active book, if you will, of living people emitting some intent expression based on that tone. And so this ties over to the idea of protest. If you've got hundreds of thousands of people gathering, against the World Trade Organization or something of that nature, they're going to, again, collectively emit their tones in a group fashion, and their collective voices as they chant or yell or whatever, that's another thing as well. And so that energetic is going to play out through that fashion, through those qualities, through those combinations. And when any endeavor is played out, whether that's, in the scientific realm, politics, finance, any number of things, again, everything under the sun, as a group dynamic is played out, there's always going to be that underlying combination of energies. And so sometimes there's the more serendipitous combination that just works and clicks, and there's that chemistry that is considered and recognized, or other times there may be a bit of a non-fit, and so there has to be an adjustment in order for the group to work. And that's not to say that the group was doomed from the start. This is where, again, the science of triangles and the science of working out in groups, it will be more considered. How to adjust the energies. If you've got these people, certainly you can exchange a member of the group, and that might be the answer. Or how do you shift the existing energies and get the right chord, the right tone emitted through the group to complete the task at hand. And that work that's emitted, or the work that is considered and created, is also, in essence, it's a thing, whether it's a plan for, something, it's an architectural drawing for a building, whatever. It's going to have that energy underlying it. It's going to have the potential for that tone. It's going to have the tone of the intent and all that, but it's going to have a potential In the instance of an architectural building and things considering things in the context of geometry, when things have a shape, that shape holds a form and therefore has a frequency. And that is why the grand cathedrals were built in certain ways, and that is why they have a certain effect. They hold a frequency, and they have an effect on people by virtue of that. And this has been known by those that, the builders, and this has been known by certain segments of society for some time. It's becoming more common knowledge in various levels. And so how do we reintroduce it, and how do we establish this as something valid and scientific to consider in relation to humanity? Another quick thing I want to mention, too, serendipitously, an old attendee of one of our metaphysical meetings showed up last night and was showing a book in which in Scotland there are these about 15-foot tall, they look kind of like grain silo, kind of towered-looking stone towers, and they have a window about, about 9 feet up. And these have a certain attunement by virtue of their structure, and there's a lot of accelerated growth around this area, and so you're going to get better growth. And so they were allegedly scattered all over Scotland, and this would theoretically lend to better farmlands, better quality soil, and that's just one consideration. Again, with architecture, geometry, certainly when we think about angles and things of that nature, different angles are going to allow for different formations and different frequencies and different sounds emitted by virtue of that. Even if we think about the Greek columns and things of that nature, when we see the old buildings, sorry, that the placement of the columns also has its own frequency. And so some people have seen where these columns were built initially and reproduced that musically, and so they've been able to translate or transcribe from the position of the columns in some buildings, and translate that into music, and translate it into some a piece of written music. And so again, it's another way in which the word or sound ties over into formation. And again, this is something that ancient peoples were very well versed in and very well aware of. And even if we know about the 7 notes in the musical scale, again, getting back to the idea of the 7 rays, 7 emanations from that original word, that original sound of creation, that this sevenfold playing out does reflect itself in many ways in manifestation. Sorry, excuse me. The 7 rays of light that are broken up, or you see the differentiation of the 7-fold light. After you put white light through a prism, you get your red, green, violet, all those different, the 7 combinations. Again, the 7 notes. And then getting back to the idea of the 7 centers. I spoke in the previous weeks about the centers and about how, as we lay our energy, as we tend to think and feel, this is where the energy is going to focus itself and redirect itself and move around. And so there are 7 main centers that the word, if you will, or sound has congealed around, and they are very much akin to the 7 planets that the ancients recognized. That also is, in that same sense, how the planets initially allegedly came into being, that they spun and spun and spun, and then that's the spherical body that we know now remained and congealed. Congealed. And so again, this is another consideration of a sphere condensing around basically a sound, and again, then emitting its own tone, its own frequency. So the 7 planets, the 7 centers, as sound and thought and all these energies focus and play through the centers, these affect our very makeup, and these affect the way in which, as I spoke of last week, that the glands work, and the way in which secretions play out, and the way in which the bloodstream is affected by virtue of that. And this, again, makes us who we are. It makes us short, tall, wide, thin, any number of combinations. It's based on, ultimately, the sound that we emit. And this gets back to our desire nature and our mind nature and how they interact with one another. How they choose to work out and play out through us on a daily basis, again, are going to give us our tone that we emit. We're going to have a basic tone, but again, if we're angry, we're going to create some fluctuation, and we're going to alter that tone, and it's not going to be as harmonic as it would have otherwise been. If we try to stay in a more positive, optimistic frame of mind and try to stay stress-free as much as possible, then we're going to emit more of our clear tone. It's more a nature of being, I guess, the clearest channel, if you will, for that word, the ultimate aspect of creation, to be recreated or remanifest through us. And so we hope to emit or reflect as truly and accurately as possible the greater sound that is God, that is the creative force in the universe. And so we keep, through different means, we can seek to align in the context with that greater sound. Certainly we have to begin to want to identify what the sound of the universe may be. And there's even there's one church group called Eckankar that do specifically really emphasize their religion based around the sound of God. And sometimes people hear like a little whirring in their ear, a little buzzing kind of noise, and that supposedly is supposed to be that a little, us tuning in to that some aspect of the sound of creation, the music of the spheres. I've experienced that myself, so I can't, it's interesting. It's definitely, as a hypothesis nonetheless, it's very interesting to consider. But that there is, again, this music playing out, and let's see, where was I going to go from there? The centers, again, I know, as far as music and emotion, and again, how we relate to definitely our emotions are tied in, and the way we think about things is affected by sound. And certainly, as I was saying, music that we may have some familiarity with from some event, like some couples will have Our Song, for instance, things of that nature, and certain music will remind you of certain events, and certain, just like certain scents, certain odors do, and things of that nature will remind us of things. But sound is very much in that same category, that it can be a reminder, it can be a trigger for certain emotions and certain thoughts that we may have experienced before. And so, again, thinking about us, we utter words collectively. When we use words, we can also, there's another great field of work that I want to consider. Actually, before I do that, I wanted to have one aside quickly, and this is related to sound as well, as far as recording. And I spoke earlier about us wanting to be, our best, truest representation, our most accurate, representation of the Word of God, if you will. We want to recreate that in our own livingness. And this can be done through meditation, certainly, where we align our emotional nature and our mental nature with our physical or our energy nature. Selfless service to humanity is certainly another way in which we attune or align with that grand energy of the architect of the universe, that phrase that's being emitted and uttered, that we can, again, tune in with. And another quick insertion as well, Masonry has the secret or lost word of Masonry that allegedly holds some indication or insight into the building process. And this is closely and carefully guarded. And there are many words or phrases or spells and things of that nature that have been passed on through different traditions that people do guard very carefully and very closely. And this is something that some may give some credit to and others may not. But again, in the context of this consideration, to me it's very interesting that there are words of power, so-called, or the prayers that are age-old, or different invocations have definite power behind them, and they can put energy into motion, and they can cause manifestations resultant from that action. And so we can create in that sense. And so as we do this, we again are emulating the Creator when we create in this fashion. Another way, obviously, that we create is through the act of procreation, to people having a baby, and the sex act, and that's another means of attunement as well. when two people are very much in love with one another and they're very attuned to one another, you're going to have an optimum attunement, an optimum situation for bringing forth children. If there's fighting, arguing, if the people are just together for very material reasons and there isn't really that attuning to one another and that real, soul recognition or soulmate kind of existence, and then I think I'm quite confident the channel is less than it might otherwise be for the entry of children. And so I think that loving couples, and certainly there are a lot of kids on the planet that come from all kind of different households, different backgrounds, and that's the way it is, and we need the lessons that we get. So sometimes we're not always born into, this most harmonious, and these loving, attuned parents. I wish that it were the case and that everyone would nurture their children and there would be, loving parents in every household and all that sort of thing. But since that's not the case, we still have to consider, two people get together, they're basically creating and they're making an image of themselves ultimately in the same way that the Creator does, and emitting a little mini word that is going to take on a life of its own. And so again, I really am confident. I really, I don't know.